"Sir, you need to leave first class immediately." The words cut through the quiet cabin so sharply that even the rustle of magazines seemed to stop. A flight attendant paused halfway down the aisle. A businessman lowered his newspaper. Somewhere near the front galley, the soft clink of a coffee cup against a saucer echoed through the silence. Malcolm Carter slowly looked up from the financial report resting on his tray table. Through the oval window beside him, the evening sky glowed orange above the runway. Boarding was nearly complete. The aircraft had not even pushed back from the gate yet. Standing beside his seat was Stephanie Brooks, the first-class supervisor. Her uniform was immaculate. Her posture was rigid. Her expression carried the kind of confidence that came from believing she was completely right. Malcolm glanced at his boarding pass resting beside a bottle of water. Then he looked back at her. "I am sorry," he asked calmly. Stephanie folded her hands in front of her. "I need you to come with me, sir." Malcolm's eyes remained steady. "Is there a problem?" Several nearby passengers pretended not to listen while clearly listening to every word. Stephanie lowered her voice slightly. "This seat has been reassigned." Malcolm glanced at the seat number above him, then at the boarding pass again. "Interesting." Stephanie's smile tightened. "We have another seat available for you." Malcolm noticed she never explained why. Across the aisle, a woman in a business suit frowned. A retired couple exchanged a glance. Something about the conversation felt wrong. Malcolm sat quietly for a moment. He had flown enough miles during his lifetime to recognize the difference between a genuine mistake and a decision someone had already made before asking questions. Stephanie looked toward the aircraft door. Her attention shifted immediately. A tall white businessman wearing an expensive tailored suit had just stepped into the cabin. Airline employees greeted him warmly. Several crew members smiled. One even offered to carry his briefcase. Malcolm noticed the contrast. So did everyone else. The businessman nodded politely and continued forward. Stephanie turned back toward Malcolm. "Sir, I really need you to move now." Malcolm picked up his boarding pass and held it out. "Would you like to verify the ticket?" Stephanie barely glanced at it. "That will not be necessary." The answer seemed to surprise even the flight attendant standing nearby. Malcolm looked at the young crew member. She appeared uncomfortable, almost as if she wanted to say something but was afraid to interrupt her supervisor. Malcolm slowly folded the boarding pass and placed it into his jacket pocket. Around him, the cabin remained unusually quiet. People were watching now, not openly, but enough. Stephanie shifted her weight. "Sir." Malcolm stood, not because he agreed, not because he felt pressured, simply because he wanted to see how far this situation would go. Stephanie visibly relaxed the moment he stepped into the aisle. The white businessman moved toward the seat Malcolm had just left. A few passengers looked away. Others continued staring. Malcolm glanced once at Stephanie's name badge. Stephanie Brooks. He memorized it without effort. Then he picked up his carry-on bag and calmly followed her toward the rear of the aircraft. As he walked away, he slipped a phone from his pocket and sent a single message. Only 6 words. "Daniel, call me the moment possible." Then he pressed send and kept walking. Malcolm followed Stephanie through the narrow aisle without saying another word. The aircraft cabin remained unusually quiet behind him. He could feel eyes tracking every step, though most passengers pretended to focus on their phones, laptops, or magazines. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from the galley. Overhead bins clicked shut as the final travelers settled into their seats. Outside the windows, baggage vehicles moved beneath bright airport lights while the last traces of sunset faded beyond the terminal. Stephanie stopped near the dividing curtain between first class and the main cabin. "This seat will be available for you," she said, gesturing toward a middle seat several rows behind the premium section. Malcolm glanced at it. Then he looked at her. "You reassigned a first-class passenger to a middle seat?" Stephanie folded her arms. "It is only for this flight." Malcolm nodded slowly. Her answer explained everything and nothing at the same time. He placed his carry-on beneath the assigned seat and sat down. Around him, families adjusted travel pillows. Business travelers opened laptops. A young mother helped her son buckle his seatbelt. Life continued normally, yet the tension from the front cabin seemed to linger in the air. Stephanie turned and walked away without another word. As she disappeared toward first class, Malcolm noticed a young flight attendant standing nearby. Her name tag read Emily Parker. Unlike the others, she did not avoid eye contact. She looked uncomfortable, Concerned, almost apologetic. Malcolm offered a polite smile. Emily hesitated before returning it. Then she quietly continued down the aisle. A few minutes later, the aircraft door closed. The captain welcomed everyone aboard and announced an expected flight time of 3 hours and 20 minutes. Passengers settled into the familiar rhythm of air travel. Seatbelts clicked. Reading lights turned on. Engines hummed softly beyond the cabin walls. Malcolm removed a folder from his bag and continued reviewing documents. Anyone watching would have assumed he was just another traveler heading to a business meeting. That was usually how he preferred it. Across the cabin, Gregory Sinclair relaxed comfortably in the first-class seat Malcolm had originally occupied. Crew members checked on him repeatedly. Drinks were offered. Extra attention seemed to appear effortlessly around him. Malcolm noticed the pattern without appearing to notice it. Several rows ahead, Emily walked toward the front galley carrying a service tray. As she passed the first-class section, she glanced at the passenger manifest displayed on a crew tablet. Her pace slowed slightly. Then she looked again. A small crease formed between her eyebrows. Something did not match. She continued walking, but the information stayed with her. A few minutes later, she checked the manifest a second time, then a third. The result remained exactly the same. Seat 2A. Malcolm Carter. Confirmed first-class ticket. Full fare. No upgrades. No standby changes. No special reassignment requests. Emily felt her stomach tighten. She looked toward the front cabin where Gregory now occupied the seat, then toward the main cabin where Malcolm sat quietly reviewing paperwork. She knew she should probably say something. The problem was that Stephanie Brooks supervised the entire premium service team. Challenging her decision would not be easy. Emily looked at the manifest one more time. The information was clear. The ticket had been valid from the beginning. Meanwhile, thousands of feet below, a phone buzzed inside a black sedan speeding toward the airport. Daniel Reed glanced at the message on the screen. Only 6 words. Yet they were enough to make him immediately tell the driver to go faster. The aircraft remained parked at the gate longer than expected. A maintenance update had delayed departure by 20 minutes, and the announcement triggered a wave of sighs throughout the cabin. Some passengers returned to their phones. Others resumed conversations. Malcolm barely noticed. He continued reviewing financial projections spread neatly across the folder on his tray table. Columns of numbers reflected softly beneath the reading light above his seat. To anyone watching, he appeared completely unaffected by what had happened. That calmness only made the situation more unusual. Most people would have complained. Some would have demanded answers. Malcolm simply kept working. Up front, Gregory Sinclair accepted another complimentary beverage while Stephanie checked on him personally. She seemed satisfied that the matter had been resolved. Every time she glanced toward the main cabin, Malcolm was still reading quietly. No confrontation. No complaint. No scene. Somehow that unsettled her more than anger would have. Near the galley, Emily Parker stood holding a crew tablet. The passenger manifest remained open on the screen. She had reviewed it 4 times now. The information never changed. Malcolm Carter was the confirmed occupant of seat 2A. First class. Purchased months earlier. No upgrades. No substitutions. No operational reassignment. Nothing justified what had happened. Emily looked toward Stephanie, then toward Malcolm. Her conscience pulled in one direction while company hierarchy pulled in another. Finally, she approached a senior flight attendant. "Can I ask you something?" she whispered. The older crew member nodded. Emily showed her the manifest. The woman studied it for several seconds. Her expression tightened. "That is strange. That is what I thought." The older attendant lowered her voice. "Did Stephanie authorize the move?" Emily nodded. The woman exhaled slowly. "Then be careful." The answer did not make Emily feel better. It only confirmed her concerns. Several rows away, Malcolm's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. "Daniel Reed." Malcolm answered immediately. "Daniel." The voice on the other end sounded concerned. "I got your message." "What happened?" Malcolm looked toward the first-class cabin. "A misunderstanding." Daniel was silent for a second. He knew Malcolm well enough to recognize that word. Whenever Malcolm called something a misunderstanding, it usually meant someone else had made a serious mistake. "Are you all right?" Daniel asked. "I am fine." "Where are you?" Malcolm told him the flight number and gate. Daniel's response came instantly. "Do not leave." Malcolm smiled faintly. "I was planning to fly to Chicago." "Good," Daniel replied. "Because I am already at the airport." The call ended moments later. Malcolm returned to his paperwork. Around him, passengers continued settling into the delay. A little boy played with a toy airplane. A businessman typed rapidly on a laptop. A grandmother showed family photos to the woman sitting beside her. Life continued. Yet something was changing beneath the surface. Up front, Emily finally made a decision. She walked directly toward Stephanie. "Can we talk for a moment?" Stephanie looked annoyed by the interruption. "What is it?" Emily lowered her voice. "I checked the manifest." Stephanie's expression hardened immediately, and Emily swallowed. "The passenger we moved appears to have had a valid first-class ticket." For the first time that evening, uncertainty flickered across Stephanie's face. Only for a second. Then it disappeared. "I handled it," she said. "Focus on your responsibilities." Emily stepped back, but the answer only deepened her concern. Meanwhile, outside the terminal windows, a black sedan pulled to a stop beneath the departure entrance. Daniel Reed stepped out, looked toward the aircraft at the gate, and began walking faster. Daniel Reed moved through the terminal with the focus of a man who understood exactly how much was at stake. His polished dress shoes echoed across the floor as he passed security checkpoints, airline counters, and crowded waiting areas. Several airport employees recognized him immediately. A few offered polite greetings. Daniel barely slowed down. His attention remained fixed on the aircraft visible through the terminal windows. The departure delay had given him a narrow window. He intended to use every second of it. Inside the cabin, passengers were beginning to grow restless. The captain announced another short delay while paperwork was finalized. A few groans drifted through the rows. Malcolm remained perfectly calm. He closed one report and opened another. The numbers on the pages represented months of negotiations. Contracts, infrastructure projects, technology upgrades, a $120 million modernization initiative that would determine the future of several airline partnerships. Malcolm had spent nearly 2 years evaluating where that money should go. Ironically, the airline currently holding his flight was one of the finalists. Across the aisle, a businessman glanced at Malcolm's documents before quickly looking away. He had only caught a brief glimpse, but he recognized enough financial terminology to realize this was not ordinary reading material. Up front, Emily continued wrestling with her conscience. She reviewed the manifest again. Then she checked internal seating records. The result was identical. Malcolm Carter had every right to occupy the first-class seat from which he had been removed. The facts could not be explained away. Finally, she approached Stephanie one more time. "I think we should correct this before departure." Stephanie looked up sharply. "I already told you the matter is resolved." Emily hesitated. "With respect, it does not appear resolved." Stephanie's jaw tightened. "Are you questioning my judgment?" The younger flight attendant immediately sensed the danger in the question. "No, ma'am." Stephanie returned to her paperwork. "Then focus on your responsibilities." Emily stepped away, but the conversation left her unsettled. Something about Stephanie's reaction felt defensive rather than confident. Several rows back, Malcolm observed the exchange without appearing to watch. Years of leadership had taught him how much people revealed through body language. The issue was no longer the seat itself. It was the refusal to acknowledge an obvious mistake. Outside the aircraft, Daniel finally reached the gate area. The airline representative behind the desk greeted him politely. "Can I help you, sir?" Daniel presented identification. The employee's eyes widened slightly. "One moment, please." Within minutes, a station manager appeared. Daniel introduced himself calmly. "I need to speak with whoever authorized the removal of Malcolm Carter from first class." The station manager blinked. "Excuse me." Daniel repeated the sentence. Slowly, clearly, the manager's expression changed. "There must be some misunderstanding." Daniel gave a small smile. "That is exactly what I am trying to determine." Back on board, the cabin lights dimmed slightly as evening settled outside. The runway lights shimmered through the windows like long lines of stars. Malcolm's phone vibrated once more. A short message appeared on the screen. "Daniel, at the gate now." Malcolm looked out the window for a moment before placing the phone back into his pocket. He remained calm, patient, almost reflective. Several passengers continued stealing curious glances toward him. None of them realized that while they worried about a delayed departure, a conversation was beginning just outside the aircraft that could soon affect far more than a single seat assignment. And at that exact moment, The station manager hurried toward the jet bridge with Stephanie Brooks' name written at the top of an urgent report. The atmosphere inside the aircraft shifted almost imperceptibly. Most passengers remained unaware of what was unfolding beyond the jet bridge, but tension had begun spreading through the crew. Stephanie noticed it first. A gate agent appeared at the front entrance and quietly motioned for her attention. The expression on his face was serious enough to make her immediately step away from the cabin. She disappeared through the aircraft door and into the jet bridge. Emily watched her leave. Something told her this conversation was connected to everything that had happened. Several minutes passed. The cabin remained still. Malcolm sat quietly reviewing documents while the engines hummed beneath the floor. Outside the window, airport vehicles moved slowly beneath pools of white light. Across the aisle, a young boy became restless from the delay. He kicked his legs gently against his seat while his mother tried to keep him entertained. A few rows ahead, an elderly woman struggled to lift a carry-on bag from beneath her seat. The bag was small but awkwardly packed. She tugged at it twice before giving up. Several nearby passengers noticed, but quickly returned to their own concerns. Malcolm closed his folder. Without hesitation, he stood and walked toward her. "May I help?" he asked. The woman looked relieved. "That would be wonderful." Malcolm carefully lifted the bag and placed it where she could reach it comfortably. A few papers slipped from one of the side pockets and scattered across the floor. He immediately knelt and helped gather them. Medical forms, family photographs, travel itineraries, ordinary pieces of someone's life. The woman smiled warmly. "Thank you." Malcolm handed the final document back to her. "You are very welcome." Nearby passengers watched quietly. The gesture was simple, small, yet it stood in sharp contrast to everything that had happened earlier. Malcolm returned to his seat as if nothing unusual had occurred. The elderly woman continued smiling long after he sat down. Up front, Stephanie finally returned to the aircraft. The confidence she had displayed earlier was noticeably diminished. Her expression looked strained, distracted. She immediately approached the lead flight attendant and whispered something. Emily noticed that Stephanie avoided looking toward Malcolm. That alone felt significant. The captain announced another short delay. This time the explanation sounded vague. Operational review. Additional coordination. Passengers exchanged frustrated looks. Some checked connecting flights. Others sighed heavily. Malcolm remained calm. His phone vibrated. A message from Daniel appeared. "We need to talk before departure." Malcolm typed a short response. "Understood." Meanwhile, inside the terminal, Daniel stood with the station manager reviewing internal records. What began as a simple complaint had already uncovered inconsistencies. Passenger manifests, seating assignments, service notes. Every document pointed toward the same conclusion. Malcolm had been removed despite holding a valid first-class ticket. The station manager looked increasingly uncomfortable. "This should never have happened," he admitted. Daniel nodded. "That is obvious." The manager exhaled slowly. "We can correct the seat assignment." Daniel looked toward the aircraft through the terminal windows. The seat was never the real problem. Those words lingered in the air. Back on board, Emily walked down the aisle with a tray of water cups. When she reached Malcolm, she paused briefly. "Sir," she said quietly. Malcolm looked up. "Yes." Emily hesitated. Then she lowered her voice. "I am sorry for what happened earlier." Malcolm studied her expression. The apology was genuine. Not corporate. Not rehearsed. Human. He offered a small smile. "Thank you." Emily nodded and continued down the aisle. For the first time all evening, Malcolm sensed that someone inside the airline was beginning to see the difference between policy and fairness. And somewhere beyond the terminal glass, decisions were already being made that would soon affect far more than a delayed flight. The delay stretched past 40 minutes. Inside the cabin, patience was beginning to wear thin. Passengers checked watches, refreshed airline apps, and exchanged quiet complaints. Yet beneath the ordinary frustration of travel, something else was developing. The mood among the crew had changed. Conversations near the galley stopped whenever Stephanie approached. Eye contact was avoided. Questions went unanswered. It was subtle, but impossible to miss. Stephanie felt it too. She sat alone in a jump seat near the front of the aircraft, reviewing messages on her company tablet. Each new notification seemed to deepen the tension in her expression. Twice she typed responses. Twice she erased them before sending. Across the cabin, Malcolm continued working. The financial report now open on his tray table contained projections for airport infrastructure upgrades, digital modernization programs, and customer experience initiatives. The numbers were significant. $120 million spread across multiple phases. He studied every detail carefully, not because he doubted the project, because he believed responsibility required attention. The elderly woman he had helped earlier glanced toward him again. "You must really enjoy paperwork," she joked. Malcolm smiled. "Only when it matters." The woman laughed softly. "That sounds like something my husband used to say." Malcolm nodded politely and returned to reading. A few rows away, Emily noticed the exchange. The more she observed Malcolm, the less the earlier decision made sense. Nothing about him matched the assumptions that had apparently guided Stephanie's actions. He was respectful, patient, professional. Most importantly, he had not once attempted to use influence or status to gain advantage. That realization stayed with her. Meanwhile, beyond the aircraft door, Daniel Reed sat inside a private conference room with the station manager and two senior airline executives who had rushed to the airport after learning the details. The atmosphere was serious. Printed reports covered the table. Passenger manifests, internal procedures, service records. Daniel remained calm throughout the discussion. "Let me be clear," he said quietly. "Mr. Carter has not asked for special treatment." One executive nodded cautiously. "We understand." Daniel folded his hands. "Good. Because this conversation is not about a seat." Silence followed. The executives exchanged glances. Daniel continued. "It is about why a paying passenger was removed from his assigned seat without proper justification." No one immediately answered. The question was uncomfortable because the facts were increasingly difficult to defend. Back on the aircraft, the captain made another announcement. This time the tone sounded unusually formal. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We are completing a final operational review before departure." Several passengers groaned. Others rolled their eyes. Malcolm simply looked out the window. The runway lights reflected across the glass like long rivers of gold. His phone vibrated. A message from Daniel appeared. "We have identified additional concerns." Malcolm read the sentence twice. Additional concerns. Those words carried weight. Daniel was not someone who exaggerated. If he had written that message, it meant the issue extended beyond a single employee. Malcolm slipped the phone back into his pocket and leaned back in his seat. For the first time that evening, his thoughts shifted away from the flight itself. He began thinking about systems, policies, culture. How many decisions were being made every day by people who never questioned their assumptions? Up front, Emily quietly reviewed company records again. This time she searched complaint histories connected to first-class seating disputes. What she found immediately made her stomach tighten. There were more reports than she expected. Much more. And as she stared at the screen, she realized the problem sitting on this aircraft tonight might be part of something much larger than anyone had imagined. Emily stared at the complaint records on her tablet while the aircraft remained parked at the gate. The glow from the screen reflected in her eyes as she scrolled through case after case. Some reports were years old. Others were only months old. Different airports, different crews, different passengers. Yet the language felt disturbingly familiar. Customers claiming they had been moved despite valid tickets. Complaints involving assumptions about status, appearance, or perceived importance. Internal reviews that ended quickly with little explanation. Emily felt a chill run through her. What had seemed like an isolated incident was beginning to look like a pattern. She closed the file and looked toward Malcolm. He was still sitting quietly in the same middle seat, reviewing documents as if none of this affected him personally. The contrast made her uncomfortable. Most people would have demanded answers by now. He had chosen patience instead. Up front, Stephanie continued receiving messages. Her shoulders looked tense. Every few minutes, she glanced toward the aircraft door. Whatever was happening outside clearly was not going according to plan. The lead flight attendant approached her quietly. "The station manager wants another update." Stephanie sighed. "I already gave one." "Apparently, he wants more details." Stephanie closed her eyes briefly. Then she stood and disappeared through the jet bridge again. Several crew members watched her leave. None of them spoke. Meanwhile, inside the airport conference room, Daniel Reed reviewed a fresh set of reports that had just been delivered. The station manager sat across from him while two airline executives listened carefully. One of the reports highlighted customer complaints tied specifically to premium cabin service. Daniel turned several pages without speaking. The silence itself became uncomfortable. Finally, he looked up. How many unresolved cases are there? The station manager hesitated. More than we initially thought. Daniel nodded slowly. That is what concerns me. One executive leaned forward. Mr. Reed, we want to make this right. Daniel's expression remained calm. Good. He folded the report closed. Because tomorrow morning the investment committee is scheduled to vote. Both executives froze. Neither had expected him to mention the committee so directly. Daniel continued. $120 million does not go to organizations that ignore warning signs. The room fell silent. Back on board, the elderly woman Malcolm had helped earlier stood carefully and reached for her bag. Before she could pull it down, a younger passenger jumped up to assist her. She smiled warmly. Thank you. Malcolm noticed the interaction and smiled faintly. Kindness had a way of spreading when someone chose to act first. A few rows away, the young boy who had been growing restless finally settled down. His mother handed him a coloring book, and within minutes he was happily drawing airplanes. The ordinary moments of travel continued around Malcolm while larger events unfolded behind the scenes. His phone vibrated once. Daniel again. Meeting progressing. More issues uncovered. Malcolm read the message and looked out the window. Airport lights stretched across the darkness like endless lines of stars. He thought about the reports Emily had likely discovered. He thought about the countless employees working honestly throughout the airline. And he thought about how easily a culture could drift when assumptions replaced accountability. Minutes later, the aircraft door opened once more. Stephanie returned, but this time she was not alone. Walking beside her was the station manager himself. The moment passengers noticed him, conversations faded. Crew members straightened immediately. The manager looked directly toward the middle of the cabin, toward Malcolm Carter. And for the first time that evening, uncertainty appeared clearly on Stephanie Brooks's face. The station manager paused near the front of the cabin, taking a slow breath before continuing down the aisle. The aircraft had become strangely quiet. Passengers who had spent the last hour complaining about delays now seemed far more interested in the unfolding situation. Conversations faded. Laptop screens lowered. Even Gregory Sinclair glanced up from his drink as the manager approached. Stephanie walked several steps behind him. Her posture remained professional, but the confidence that had defined her earlier had begun to crack. Malcolm looked up from his documents as the manager stopped beside his seat. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then the manager offered a polite smile. Mr. Carter? Malcolm nodded. Yes. The manager extended his hand. My name is Robert Jenkins. I oversee airport operations for this region. Malcolm shook his hand. The gesture immediately caught the attention of several nearby passengers. Executives did not usually board delayed aircraft to introduce themselves to random travelers. Robert released the handshake and spoke carefully. I would like to personally apologize for the inconvenience you experienced this evening. The cabin grew even quieter. Stephanie stared at the floor. Malcolm remained calm. Thank you, he said. Robert nodded. Your original seat assignment has been confirmed. There was no operational reason for the reassignment. The honesty surprised several people within earshot. Gregory slowly lowered his cup. Emily stood near the galley pretending to organize supplies while listening closely. Robert continued. We would like to move you back to your assigned seat immediately. Malcolm studied the man's expression. The apology appeared genuine. The correction was appropriate. Yet something still felt unfinished. I appreciate that, he replied. But the seat itself was never the issue. Robert's expression tightened slightly. He understood exactly what Malcolm meant. A few nearby passengers exchanged glances. They understood too. The manager nodded. I agree. The answer carried more weight than a simple apology. It acknowledged that the problem extended beyond logistics. Stephanie finally looked up. Her eyes met Malcolm's for only a moment before dropping again. For the first time all evening, she appeared uncertain of her own decisions. Robert cleared his throat. There is another matter. Malcolm waited. The manager glanced toward the front of the aircraft, then back at Malcolm. Someone has arrived requesting to speak with you. Malcolm already knew who it was. Even so, he asked who. Robert smiled faintly. Daniel Reed. The reaction was immediate. Emily recognized the name. So did one of the business travelers nearby. Gregory's eyebrows lifted slightly. Stephanie's expression froze. Robert continued. He is waiting at the gate. Malcolm closed the folder on his tray table. Around him, curiosity spread through the cabin. Nobody knew exactly why the name mattered, but the station manager's behavior suggested it mattered a great deal. Malcolm stood and straightened his sweater. Then I should probably speak with him. Robert stepped aside respectfully. As Malcolm gathered his carry-on bag, the elderly woman he had helped earlier smiled. I hope they finally start listening. Malcolm returned the smile. So do I. Emily watched him walk toward the front of the aircraft. Something about the moment felt larger than a customer complaint, larger than a seating dispute. She glanced at Stephanie, whose face had gone noticeably pale. The supervisor appeared to be realizing that the evening was moving beyond her control. Outside the aircraft, Daniel stood near the jet bridge entrance holding a folder thick with financial reports. Airport executives surrounded him. Their expressions were serious, concerned, focused. And as Malcolm stepped through the aircraft door and into the jet bridge, every conversation stopped. The jet bridge felt unusually quiet. The hum of the aircraft engines faded behind the insulated walls while airport lights cast long reflections across the floor. Daniel Reed stood waiting near the entrance, a thick folder tucked beneath one arm. Beside him stood two airline executives, the station manager, and a legal advisor who had arrived only minutes earlier. The moment Malcolm stepped through the aircraft door, Daniel's expression softened. There you are. Malcolm smiled faintly. I had a seat change. Several executives exchanged uncomfortable glances. Daniel shook his head. I heard. The understatement almost made Malcolm laugh. Daniel extended his hand. They shook firmly. The gesture itself seemed ordinary, yet everyone watching understood it was not. These were not two strangers meeting at an airport. These were two men who had worked together for more than a decade. Men who routinely made decisions involving hundreds of millions of dollars. One executive finally stepped forward. Mr. Carter, I would like to personally apologize. Malcolm nodded politely. Thank you. The man continued. What happened tonight does not reflect our standards. Malcolm looked toward the aircraft behind them. Through the small window in the door, passengers remained visible in their seats. Waiting. Watching. Then perhaps it reflects something else. The executive had no immediate answer. Silence settled over the group. Daniel opened the folder he had been carrying. Inside were financial summaries, infrastructure proposals, modernization schedules, and partnership agreements. The top page contained a familiar number, $120 million. The legal advisor noticed Malcolm's eyes settle on the document and visibly swallowed. The significance was impossible to ignore. One of the executives cleared his throat. The investment committee meeting is tomorrow morning. Daniel nodded. Correct. The executive shifted uneasily. And Mr. Carter is. Daniel looked at him calmly. The final approval authority. The words landed with the force of a sudden storm. Nobody spoke. Even the station manager seemed frozen for a moment. The executive's face lost color. He had known Malcolm was important. He had not realized how important. Inside the aircraft, Emily stood near the front galley watching through the partially open door. She could not hear every word, but she could see the reactions. The airline executives were treating Malcolm with a level of respect normally reserved for major corporate partners. Stephanie noticed it too. Her stomach tightened. For the first time, she understood that the passenger she had removed from first class was not merely a traveler. He was one of the people helping decide the future of the airline itself. Yet what unsettled her most was not his influence. It was the fact that he had never once mentioned it. Back in the jet bridge, Daniel handed Malcolm the folder. There is something else you should see. Malcolm flipped through several pages. Internal complaint summaries. Customer service reports. Escalation records. Some were familiar. Others were not. As he read, a pattern began emerging. Similar complaints. Similar outcomes. Similar explanations. Different airports. Different employees. The same concerns. Malcolm slowly closed the folder. The airport seemed quieter than before. How many cases? He asked. Daniel answered immediately. More than 40 over the last 3 years. One executive lowered his eyes. Another looked toward the floor. The number spoke for itself. Malcolm stared at the folder for several seconds. Then he looked back toward the aircraft. Passengers still waiting. Crew members still working. Employees trying to do the right thing inside a system that sometimes made the wrong thing easier. Finally, he spoke. His voice remained calm. Then tomorrow's meeting is no longer just about investment. And as those words settled over the group, Every executive standing in the jet bridge realized the conversation had become far more serious than anyone had expected. The executives remained silent long after Malcolm finished speaking. The jet bridge suddenly felt smaller, as though the weight of the conversation had filled every inch of space. Outside the windows, airport lights stretched across the tarmac beneath the dark sky. Ground crews continued working. Aircraft continued arriving and departing. Yet for the people standing there, the evening had become something entirely different. Malcolm opened the folder once more and reviewed several pages. Complaint summaries, internal reviews, escalation records. The numbers were impossible to ignore. More than 40 incidents over 3 years. Different locations. Similar patterns. Similar conclusions. The problem was no longer a single employee making a poor decision. The evidence suggested something much deeper. Daniel watched him carefully. He knew that expression. Malcolm was not angry. He was evaluating. That was usually far more significant. One executive finally broke the silence. "Mr. Carter, we are committed to correcting these issues." Malcolm looked up. "I believe you want to." The executive nodded quickly. Malcolm closed the folder. "The question is whether the organization has been willing to see them." Nobody answered. Because nobody could. Back inside the aircraft, passengers continued waiting. Rumors had begun spreading quietly through the cabin. People had noticed the station manager. They had noticed the executives. They had noticed the unusual attention surrounding the passenger who had been removed from first class. Gregory Sinclair sat unusually still now. Earlier, he had accepted the upgraded treatment without much thought. Now he found himself replaying the entire evening. The more he reflected on it, the less comfortable he felt. Near the galley, Emily continued helping passengers while watching the jet bridge through the partially open door. She could not hear what was being said, but she could see the seriousness on every face. Stephanie remained nearby, silent for perhaps the first time all evening. Her tablet rested untouched in her hands. The confidence that had guided her earlier decisions had given way to uncertainty. She was beginning to understand that assumptions carried consequences. Back in the jet bridge, Daniel received a message on his phone. He read it and immediately handed the screen to Malcolm. A new report had arrived from the investment committee. Additional review findings. Customer satisfaction metrics. Internal audit notes. Malcolm scanned several pages before stopping. One sentence stood out. Multiple warnings were documented but never escalated beyond regional review. Malcolm slowly lowered the phone. "How long have senior leadership known about this?" One executive answered honestly. "Some concerns were identified before." "And?" Malcolm asked. The man looked down. The responses were insufficient. The admission hung in the air. Nobody attempted to defend it. Daniel folded his arms. "That is an expensive mistake." Another executive nodded grimly. He understood exactly what Daniel meant. The airline was expecting final approval on a $120 million modernization partnership. Airports, technology systems, customer experience upgrades. The project represented years of planning. Yet every dollar depended upon trust. And trust was becoming harder to justify. Malcolm looked through the aircraft window. He saw passengers waiting patiently. Employees trying to do their jobs. People who would be affected by decisions made far above their pay grade. That mattered to him. More than headlines. More than public relations. Finally, he handed the reports back to Daniel. "Tomorrow morning, I am freezing committee approval until a full independent review is completed." Nobody spoke. The words landed with absolute clarity. One executive closed his eyes briefly. Another exhaled slowly. The station manager stared at the floor. Daniel nodded once. He had expected exactly that decision. Malcolm's voice remained calm. "If these reports are accurate, approving funding tonight would reward behavior that should have been corrected years ago." Silence followed. Heavy. Unavoidable. Then Malcolm looked toward the aircraft door. "Now let's get these passengers home." And in that moment, everyone standing around him realized the story was no longer about a first-class seat. It had become a test of whether an entire company was willing to change. The aircraft finally pushed back from the gate nearly an hour after its scheduled departure. As the cabin lights dimmed for takeoff, a strange quiet settled over everyone on board. Passengers sensed that something significant had happened, even if most of them did not know the details. The engines increased in power. The runway lights blurred beyond the windows. Within minutes, the aircraft lifted into the night sky and climbed above the city. Malcolm sat once again in his original first-class seat. The reassignment had been corrected before departure, but the seat itself felt almost irrelevant now. He looked out at the clouds illuminated by moonlight and thought about the reports Daniel had shown him. More than 40 complaints, multiple warnings, years of missed opportunities to fix a growing problem. Across the aisle, Gregory Sinclair remained unusually quiet. Earlier, he had accepted special treatment without question. Now he found himself replaying every moment. Eventually, he turned toward Malcolm. "May I say something?" Malcolm looked over. "Of course." Gregory hesitated. "I did not know what was happening when I boarded." Malcolm nodded. "I believe you." Gregory looked down briefly. "But I should have asked more questions." The honesty surprised Malcolm. Most people do not. Gregory managed a faint smile. Maybe they should. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Gregory extended his hand. Malcolm shook it. Nothing dramatic. No speeches. Just two adults recognizing something important. A few rows behind them, Emily continued working the cabin. She noticed the exchange and felt relieved. The tension that had dominated the evening was slowly giving way to reflection. Even some crew members seemed changed by what they had witnessed. Near the front galley, Stephanie sat quietly reviewing company messages. The latest notification informed her that a formal review process had begun. Additional interviews would follow. Documentation would be collected. Procedures would be examined. She stared at the screen for a long time. Earlier in the evening, she had viewed the situation as routine. Now she understood that assumptions made in seconds could affect people in ways she had never fully considered. For perhaps the first time in years, she was forced to examine her own decisions honestly. Thousands of feet below, Daniel remained in the airport conference room. New calls continued arriving from senior leadership. Emergency meetings had already been scheduled. Board members wanted updates. Investors wanted explanations. Executives wanted solutions. Daniel answered questions calmly, but one message remained consistent. The issue was not the funding freeze. The issue was the behavior that had caused it. Back on board, the elderly woman Malcolm had helped earlier passed his seat on her way to the restroom. She stopped briefly. "Looks like things worked out." Malcolm smiled. "Not yet." The woman laughed softly. "Fair enough." After she continued down the aisle, Malcolm opened his notebook and wrote a single sentence across the top of a blank page. "Accountability creates trust." Then he underlined it once. Outside the window, the stars stretched across the darkness. The aircraft moved steadily toward Chicago. Inside the cabin, people returned to ordinary travel routines. Reading, sleeping, working. Yet beneath those ordinary moments, something important had shifted. Not because someone powerful had exercised authority, because someone had finally chosen to pay attention. And far ahead, waiting at the end of the flight, was a meeting that would determine whether an entire organization was willing to learn from the lesson this night had revealed. The aircraft touched down in Chicago just after midnight. As the wheels met the runway, a gentle vibration moved through the cabin. Passengers looked up from books, laptops, and half-finished conversations. Outside the windows, rows of blue taxiway lights stretched across the darkness. The flight that had begun with tension ended in unusual silence. When the aircraft reached the gate, most people remained seated longer than usual. Some were tired. Others were curious. They sensed that the story unfolding around them was not quite finished. Malcolm remained in his seat until the aisle cleared. He gathered his notebook, closed his folder, and stood. Across the aisle, Gregory Sinclair nodded respectfully. "Good luck tomorrow." Malcolm smiled. "Thank you." The exchange was simple, but genuine. A few rows behind them, the elderly woman waved before leaving the aircraft. Emily watched quietly from the galley. She had spent the entire flight thinking about the complaint records she had discovered. The more she reflected on them, the more determined she became to speak honestly during the review process. As passengers exited into the terminal, airport personnel waited near the gate. Daniel stood among them holding another stack of reports. Several senior executives had flown in overnight after learning what had happened. Their presence alone revealed how seriously the situation was now being treated. When Malcolm stepped into the terminal, Daniel handed him a summary of the latest developments. Independent investigators had already been assigned. Internal audits had begun. Regional leaders had been instructed to provide records dating back several years. The process was moving faster than anyone expected. One executive approached cautiously. "Mr. Carter, Thank you for meeting with us tomorrow morning. Malcolm looked at him calmly. Tomorrow is not about me. The executive paused. Malcolm continued. It is about whether the people who trusted your company were treated fairly. The man nodded slowly. For perhaps the first time, the conversation shifted away from damage control and toward responsibility. Several hours later, inside a glass-walled conference room overlooking downtown Chicago, senior leadership gathered before sunrise. Reports covered the table. Charts glowed across presentation screens. Compliance officers, legal teams, customer experience specialists, and board representatives filled the room. Daniel presented the findings first. The numbers spoke clearly. Repeated complaints, missed opportunities, inconsistent investigations, gaps that should have been addressed years earlier. Nobody attempted to dismiss the evidence. When Daniel finished, the room remained silent. Then Malcolm stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse anyone. Instead, he spoke about trust, about how every customer carried a story that employees could not see, about how assumptions could quietly become habits if nobody challenged them. Several executives lowered their eyes as he spoke. Others took notes. Some appeared genuinely shaken. When he finished, the chairperson of the board looked around the room. We cannot change what happened yesterday, she said quietly, but we can decide what happens next. One by one, commitments were made. Independent oversight, new review procedures, enhanced employee training, clear escalation channels, transparent reporting, real accountability, not promises for a press release, actual changes tied to measurable outcomes. As morning sunlight slowly filled the conference room, Malcolm looked out across the city skyline. The funding remained frozen. That decision would not change until progress could be verified. Yet for the first time since boarding the flight, he felt cautiously hopeful. Because what began as one passenger being removed from a seat had finally become something larger. A chance for an entire organization to prove that learning was still possible. 6 months later, the airport looked exactly the same from a distance. Travelers hurried beneath departure boards. Rolling suitcases crossed polished floors. Aircraft lifted into bright morning skies. Yet inside the company, many things had changed. New review procedures had been implemented across multiple regions. Independent audits continued. Customer complaints were tracked through transparent systems. Managers received additional training focused on fairness, accountability, and decision-making. Progress reports were no longer hidden inside forgotten files. They were reviewed openly, carefully, consistently. The investment committee had monitored every step. Malcolm had insisted on measurable results rather than promises. And for the first time in years, the data showed genuine improvement. On a cool autumn morning, Malcolm arrived at another airport for another flight. He wore the same kind of simple clothing he always preferred. No entourage, no special introductions, no public announcements. Most people passing him had no idea who he was. He liked it that way. As he walked through the terminal, he noticed something familiar. A young employee was helping an elderly traveler whose boarding pass had been misplaced. The employee remained patient despite the growing line. Calm, respectful, focused on solving the problem. Malcolm smiled slightly and continued walking. Near the gate, a framed notice displayed the company's updated customer commitment statement. The language was simple. Every passenger deserves dignity. Every concern deserves attention. Every employee is responsible for accountability. Malcolm stopped for a moment and read the words. Then he kept moving. When boarding began, another familiar face appeared nearby. Emily Parker. Her uniform had changed. The small silver badge on her jacket now identified her as a customer experience supervisor. She noticed Malcolm immediately and smiled. Good morning, Mr. Carter. Malcolm smiled back. Good morning, Emily. Her confidence had grown. So had her responsibilities. During the months following the investigation, her honesty had helped identify problems others ignored. She had become one of the voices leading improvements throughout the organization. How are things? Malcolm asked. Emily glanced toward the boarding area where employees assisted travelers. Better, she said. Still work to do, but better. Malcolm nodded. That was the answer he had hoped to hear. A few minutes later, passengers began boarding. Families, business travelers, students, retirees, different backgrounds, different destinations. One line, one process, no special assumptions, no shortcuts based on appearances. As Malcolm entered the aircraft, He passed several crew members greeting customers with genuine professionalism. Nobody recognized the story that had begun months earlier on another flight. Nobody knew that a simple seat reassignment had eventually forced an entire organization to confront uncomfortable truths. And that was fine. The goal had never been recognition. The goal had been change. Malcolm settled into his seat beside the window. Outside, sunlight reflected across the wing. Inside, passengers stored luggage and prepared for departure. The familiar sounds returned. Seatbelts clicking, quiet conversations, the soft hum of conditioned air. Ordinary moments. The kind people rarely remember. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Malcolm looked through the window toward the terminal. Somewhere beyond the glass, thousands of employees were beginning another day. Most would never meet him. Most would never know his name. But if they remembered to treat the next passenger with dignity, that was enough. The engines grew louder. The runway stretched ahead. And as the aircraft accelerated into the morning light, Malcolm closed his notebook, leaned back in his seat, and watched a new day begin.